Well, as you will gather from the front of the service sheet and has been said, we are celebrating the third Sunday in the season of creation. But it just happens to coincide with the actual St. Matthew's feast day, so I can't resist the opportunity to play a bit with both themes. I was reflecting to my husband Gregory, I've been here 9 years and I'm yet to preach on St. Matthew's Day, so here we go. And also, after today's service, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss and look at some themes about what climate justice looks like in this beautiful land that we live in. So I think we'll get a little bit more to be able to discuss together. Well, as we just heard in the Gospel, Jesus calls Matthew. We assume he's a tax collector because he's behind a table for collecting tax. Without ado, Matthew gets up and he follows. Immediately, we then find ourselves in the midst of a dinner party. Jesus and his disciples are hanging out with a disreputable crowd, and they are told off doing so for boundary crossing. They're told off by some of those in religious leadership. This tells us something about Jesus, but it could also be telling us what choosing a disciple to be a disciple might look like. Being a disciple may lead us to seeing through the status quo, to questioning the status quo, being willing to upset and to upend it. The story takes place in a religious context. We hear the story in a religious context. Matthew says yes into this context. What did Matthew say yes to? By example, we see Jesus shows Matthew. Matthew says yes to a way that is willing to defy and to deconstruct the identity rules of that same religious context. Jesus' retort to the Pharisees falls within the context, that religious bounds. But what he then says, I desire mercy, not sacrificed, reaches way beyond the religious. Mercy, not sacrifice, is a founding orientation toward life. We could expand it: compassion, not condemnation, humility, not hubris. Pretty much the opposite of the way we operate. The challenge of such orientation spills naturally and readily into our relationship with creation. It's hard to imagine what it might look like if we were to actually do it. So perhaps this parable, Finding Faith, by Peter Rollins, from his book The Orthodox Heretic, might help. Be prepared to be a little unsettled. There was once a fiery preacher who possessed a powerful but unusual gift. He found that from an early age, when he prayed for individuals, they would supernaturally lose all of their religious convictions. They would invariably lose all of their beliefs about the prophets, the sacred scriptures, and even God. So, the preacher learned not to pray for people, but instead he limited himself to preaching inspiring sermons and doing good works. However, one day while travelling across the country, the preacher found himself in a conversation with a businessman. They happened to be going the same direction. The businessman was a very powerful and a ruthless merchant banker who was honoured by his colleagues and respected by his adversaries. Their conversation began because the businessman, possessing a deep, abiding faith, had noticed the preacher reading from the Bible. He introduced himself to the preacher and they began to talk. As they chatted together, this powerful man told the preacher all about his faith in God and his love of Christ. He spoke of how his work did not really define who he was, but was simply what he had to do. The world of business is a cold one, he confided to the preacher. And in my line of work, I find myself in situations that challenge my Christian convictions. But I try, as much as possible, to remain true to my faith. Indeed, I attend a local church every Sunday. I participate in a prayer circle, I engage in some youth work and contribute to a weekly Bible study. These activities help me to remind me of who I really am. After listening carefully to the businessman's story, the preacher began to realize the purpose of his unseemly gift. So he turned to the businessman and said, "Would you allow me to pray a blessing onto your life?" The businessman readily agreed, unaware of what would happen. Sure enough, after the preacher had muttered a simple prayer, the man opened his eyes in astonishment. "What a fool I have been for all these years," he proclaimed. "It is clear to me now that there is no God above who is looking after me. There are no sacred texts to guide me. There is no spirit to inspire and protect me." As I parted company, the businessman, still confused by what had taken place, returned home. But now that he no longer had any religious beliefs, he began to find it increasingly difficult to continue in his line of work. Faced with the fact that he was now just a hard-nosed businessman working in a corrupt system rather than a man of God, he began to despise his work. Within months he had a breakdown, and soon afterward he gave up his line of work completely. Feeling better about himself, he then went on to give to the poor all of the riches he had accumulated, and he began to use his considerable managerial expertise to challenge the very system he once participated in, and to help those who had been oppressed by the system. One day, many years later, he happened upon the preacher again while walking through town. He ran over, fell at the preacher's feet, and began to weep with joy. Eventually, he looked up at the preacher and smiled. "Thank you, my dearest friend, for helping me to discover my faith." It's a curious tale, one that has played over in my mind this last while. Such is the nature of a parable. We might ask, is it proposing that the impetus and energy to act justly, to work to dismantle systems that oppress and diminish, that these arise in us naturally, and that the construct of religion serves to obstruct this? Given it's St. Matthew's Day, a date in the calendar determined by church tradition over time, this gave me pause for thought. Of course, we will celebrate this together next Sunday, and it is a good thing to celebrate the life of St. Matthew's, 120 years of ministry, of continuing faith witnessed by the people of St. Matthew's in Tamaki Makaurau, to honour the unique place and identity St. Matthew's does have in this city. But the Rollins parable presses in on this. Does the identity we've constructed enable us to discover our faith and live it out, as the parable articulates? In the Gospel today, Matthew's response to Jesus' call is simple and it is immediate. Matthew hears and acts, and it would seem, steps into the costliness of discipleship that Jesus' actions around the dinner table reveal. The church we participate in today has evolved to be the religious monolith we know. The church institution, its structure and system, has become the Jesus identity for those who now hear the call. These two things seem to stand in stark contrast one to the other. The institutional mantle provides identity and certainty and security and protection. But has it come to prevent us from discovering faith that leads us to enact mercy, not sacrifice, compassion, not condemnation, humility, not hubris, both inside and outside the world? Perhaps thankfully we hear that Jesus calls those who are sick and sinners, not the righteous, those disoriented who need to be reoriented, who need to go and learn. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. They are the ones that hear the call. In accepting our call, do we accept the sick, sinner, not righteous, not aligned with life-bringing ways identity? Ironically, if it were not so, we may not have heard the call. Accepting this honest truth about ourselves may free us from that identity we've constructed that makes us feel self-reliant and impervious. Open us to see and to receive our unique identity as those divinely loved into being, because that is who we are. It may just be, if we are willing to engage in a process of stripping back away all we presume, all the constructs by which we justify our way of being and living, it may just be that it will release in us faith to live in ways that bring life. Faith that does differently. Faith that reveals and names injustice and acts so justice is granted for all of creation. Of course, we might want to ask ourselves, do we actually want it?